Today we have the opportunity to speak to the distinguished economist Vicky Pryce, who has worked in a number of roles in the public and private sector, as the joint head of the UK Government Economic Service and as senior managing director at FTI Consulting. She is a patron of pro bono economics. Vicky has also written a number of books on everything from the Greek debt crisis to the flaws of a free market economy for gender equality. I could spend far longer listing her numerous achievements, but I know that our listeners at GAEE UK are interested in hearing her opinion on many of the economic issues of the day. Thank you for being here today, Vicky.
I'm delighted. Thank you.
In your book, Women versus Capitalism, you discussed the need for reform to the capitalist system as it stands to address gender inequality. What do you think that this pandemic has revealed about the disproportionate impact of unemployment and wage stagnation on women?
What I had covered in my book had been the inequality that we have between the genders. And really the issue is not just economic inequality, but also in relation to the rights that women have and their position in society, and also whether they're represented in parliament, for example, their access to health. And that, of course, is very significant in different parts of the world because it holds women back. The real problem is that a number of the obstacles that exist in developing countries also exist in developed economies. And when you look at the progress towards gender equality, it is quite obvious that the various barriers for women working to their full capacity have a direct impact on the economy as well, and on productivity, on welfare, prosperity more generally, and of course, well-being as well. And it does affect the way in which women pass things on to the next generation. And therefore, it affects development over a period of time. So there is a real economic reason why we need to address gender equality in a more significant way so that we are able to achieve it at some point. The World Economic Forum has done some calculations that suggest that we not actually get to gender equality for another 100 and under some measures 200 years. So there needs to be some real focus on getting there a little bit faster than that. And any progress that women have made has come from government intervention, because all the issues that I mentioned before, the various barriers for women, effectively create market failures that need to be addressed by governments, because otherwise we won't get the results that we want in terms of the economy. So what's happened with the pandemic? I mean, the reality is that women tend to be employed or tend to occupy the areas which are worst paid when you look at the overall pay scale across the economy. So the ghettoized areas. I'm afraid health and social care is very much one of those. Women across the world, in fact, account for something like 70% of all the people who work in healthcare, health services and care more generally. And of course, they have been much more subjected to the problems of possibly catching and even dying from the pandemic, a lot more than the men, given that they have much more exposure to it. Now, it does not mean that they necessarily have died in bigger numbers, but they've certainly been affected by this. At the same time, they also occupy the types of professions which have been worst hit by the pandemic, such as retail, where a lot of face-to-face is absolutely important, hospitality and leisure. So they have been affected by this. But the interesting thing is that in terms of employment, they haven't suffered more overall than men. But what they have suffered is in terms of A, their ability to do the work, and B, the money that they have been getting, which of course has meant that in many cases, they have moved much closer to the poverty line than was the case before. Now, why is this? The reason for it, if you look at what has been happening to the various professions, and also if you look at the range of jobs that people have been able to still do from home, what you find is that the higher you get paid, the more likely it is that you'll be able to do the various tasks that are expected of you from home, which is what very many of us have been doing for the last year or so. The lower paid you are, the less likely that is, because you tend to work in areas which require this face-to-face contact and where the use of technology doesn't really get you anywhere. I'm afraid women are very much in that position. And also, of course, they have had to take on a lot more in terms of homeschooling, looking after the house. So they reverted back to the types of roles that they used to have before. And they basically haven't been able to put the hours in that are expected of them. So they are much more likely to have either been made redundant or just reduce their hours, with the result, of course, that they are also seeing their overall earnings being affected. And that, of course, has quite a substantial impact on their children, their ability to keep their own kids above the poverty line. And we've seen already what's been happening in terms of, you know, the number of kids who now absolutely need extra support in terms of free school meals and so on. So that is a concern. In addition, what we had at least managed to achieve is force big firms to report their pay gaps. That had started to work reasonably well. There had been a voluntary arrangement, which hardly any big firms were following really, and then legislation was enacted to force them to do so. Well, that type of legislation has now been postponed, or was certainly postponed during the pandemic. We haven't got a clue what's going on in various organizations, and hopefully when the figures are coming out, they will make some sense, because obviously there will have been to a considerable extent distorted by what's been happening during the pandemic. So we've got a real fear, all of us who have been looking and tracking women's progress, that we're going to come out of this pandemic. Maybe the data isn't necessarily going to show it in terms of the pay gap, but there will have been scarring, long-term scarring for women who will probably find it quite hard to recover quickly the positions they had before and certainly advance the way we'd like them to.
Thank you for that answer. And on that issue, you touched on improving access to childcare as a method of achieving gender equality in your book. I was wondering what else can be done to ensure fairness from the classroom to the boardroom in regards to gender equality and advancement of women.
I think if you look at the classroom, what you need is perhaps better careers advice from very early on, so that women know the opportunities that there are and they can go and study the right thing. I think that matters hugely. And the more obviously they populate the various professions which earn quite a bit once you get there, the more likely it is that they will be able to make some change that will also affect everybody else around them. It doesn't mean that it will happen overnight at all, but certainly, you know, studying the right thing is a step in the right direction. But there is, of course, huge amount of bias. Some of it is overt bias, some of it is covert bias. So there is a considerable amount of effort that needs to be made to overcome that. And yes, of course, you can teach quite a lot of people how to deal with or understand even unconscious bias. What works best is having a board or an organization that really pushes that better behavior all across its organization, so that, you know, men and women know where they stand, and also the policies that are developed as such that they keep women interested and employed, rather than them departing from an organization because they face this unconscious bias and conscious bias quite early on, particularly though once they have children. How do you achieve that? Quite a lot of naming and shaming, I suppose, up to a point, but my view is that you need quotas for women in senior positions, which then permeate through the organization, because you need to absolutely keep the pipeline going. And if you keep the pipeline going and you have to meet those quotas, and it is part of legislation and you can be penalized if you don't achieve it over a period of time, then you are much more likely to have the type of organization that benefits both men and women, because you allow greater flexibility, you care about advancement, you make sure that training is given properly, and that can only lead to better performing company. And at the end of the day, if more people are able to work at the skill level and above, if they're allowed, then the economy also does well in terms of productivity and growth.
Thank you for that. And in terms of productivity and growth, the Bank of England has recently said that it expects a rapid economic recovery fueled by the widespread adoption of the vaccine. What policies can central banks implement, in your opinion, to fuel a recovery and allow for sustainable long-term economic growth?
What they have done so far, of course, is support very much the fiscal expansion that we've seen various governments being engaged in. There was no way in which we could have got to the point where we are now, where there is some money, people have saved some cash, they've managed to keep their jobs, even though they may not have been working in them to a considerable extent through furlough schemes. Firms have been able to borrow from the banks, supported by the Bank of England, on government-backed loans. So there's guarantee for the banks at any rate if a firm cannot in the longer term repay. The firms have been able to take advantage of all those loans. They are called, for the smaller firms, bounce back loans, to allow you to bounce back when indeed the economy starts to recover without having this enormous debt over you that you've got to pay straight away. So terms have been extended. The interest rate is reasonably low for the moment. So there has been huge expansion in liquidity in the economy, and the Bank of England has been very instrumental in that, as has been the case with central banks all across the world, whether you look at the Federal Reserve in the States, whether you look at the Central Bank of Japan, or whether you look at the European Central Bank, which has also injected enormous amounts of liquidity into the system and supported this banking sector to ensure that liquidity still flows and that both individuals and businesses have the money. The most important thing that they have done is, in my view, to also be absolutely prepared to buy government debt in the secondary market. What has been going on is that in order to finance this enormous fiscal deficit that everyone has had and making sure the economies can then bounce back, the central banks have been buying the government debt that has been issued by their treasuries or the finance departments, depending on which country you're in. They have been prepared to buy it in the secondary market. So investors who come in buy those bonds that the central bank, that the finance department or the treasury in this case issue, but they know that there is a willing buyer at the other end if they want to get out of it. And that willing buyer is the central bank, which has been indeed buying back those bonds. And in the process, of course, increasing its own balance sheet, but reducing the yields on those bonds, because they're fixed interest bonds. The more you buy and raise the price, the yield goes down. It means that all interest rates across the economy, particularly long-term ones, come down, which of course helps with mortgages, helps with investment, hopefully. And if they're managing to keep those rates down, then the chances of a bounce back being more sustainable in the future, of course, increase.
Thank you. Now, a consequence of the significant spending recovery programs that have been implemented by finance ministries and central banks has, of course, been the significant national debt accumulated. How can that debt be managed to reduce the impact that it has on long-term economic recovery?
Debts have indeed increased all across the world, and in the UK, the debt to GDP ratio has exceeded 100% of GDP, and it's likely to rise to maybe 110, maybe on some scenarios even more. But remember, quite a lot of countries have very high debt to GDP ratios, and they've had them for ages. That includes Japan, it includes China, it includes in Europe places like Italy. It includes, of course, Greece, which was quite near 200% just at the beginning of the pandemic. It includes Spain at 100%. So we're not the only ones, and Spain's would have gone up since. And if anything, The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and others are all encouraging countries to continue to spend and continue to borrow, because the markets seem to think that it's much more sustainable now for them to borrow, given that interest rates are so low. Before, you thought that 90% debt to GDP ratio was really the limit, because beyond that, nobody would lend to you, and you would have to really seriously, have very substantial growth in your output in the economy, in your GDP, to be able to meet the interest payments you'd have to make. But now, with interest payments being so low, at times they have been negative, even for longish bonds that are issued, that pressure isn't there. So you can carry on for longer. But the really important message to any government which is worried about its debt is, what you need to do is get growth going, and you need growth to be sustainable. And that brings your debt to GDP ratio down. And the reality is that you are still going to have to support the economy for quite some time to come. And in the forecast that exists at present, the UK would still need, in 4 years' time, to be borrowing something like £100 billion a year from the markets, which is twice as much as we borrowed in 2019 for the year as a whole. So we've moved into a completely different space. The idea that you can start seriously reducing your actual debt can only be done really through austerity. And we've already seen, after the financial crisis, the problems that austerity caused in all sorts of ways, whether it's on productivity in the long term, whether it's on equality, whether it's on wages, which has only just got back to where they were before the financial crisis, just as the pandemic hit. We don't want to repeat that.
Thank you. The labour force has, of course, been significantly scarred by the pandemic, and that scarring has coincided with the changing technological landscape that will likely affect the labour force significantly in the coming years. Is increased unemployment as a result of the combined factors of COVID-19 and automation inevitable, or can governments enact policies to alleviate much of the damage done?
The truth is, if you look back at history, there have been a number of periods when everyone thought that automation, or changing from, let's say, the horse and cart to the combustion engine, was going to lead to huge increases in unemployment. And of course, for those who had been involved in those areas, that was indeed true. And some regions, of course, have suffered as a result of the Industrial Revolution first, and then deindustrialization that followed. So we have to bear in mind that government intervention is going to be needed at various stages. Very often you may need to do some more reskilling. It is a worry. What the pandemic has shown is that you can do lots of things with fewer people, and you can do it also from home. You don't need the office. You also, if you're going to be avoiding face-to-face, you can substitute people with machines. And we had already seen that happening to a considerable extent in the retail sector even before the pandemic hit. So there had been sort of an average of something like 150,000 job losses in the retail sector in the UK alone in the years before the pandemic, and there were another 177,000, as I understand it, last year, and there will be 200,000 of those losses this year. Now, we have been able as an economy to redeploy people, unfortunately not always in better paid jobs, quite often in worse paid jobs. There is now a suggestion that don't worry about it, everyone can now move and work in the care sector, where the care sector tends to pay less for the moment than the retail sector was paying. So you do have a problem in terms of salaries, you do have a problem in terms of living standards, and you also have a huge problem in terms of reskilling. We're now saying we're going to move to more green. Well, that sounds okay. You do need to invest heavily in that. And if businesses do it and then redeploy people and train them, that's fine. But the likelihood still is that quite a lot of jobs will be done more by machines, and you have to invent or think of new ones. It's not just green. What happens to the creative sector? What happens to the types of leisure that we all want to see Who provides that? Are there going to be huge extra opportunities? You've seen that with Netflix, for example, and so on. And new channels appearing everywhere. Are we all going to become actors or designers or whatever else it is that all these people do? Maybe we will change the way in which we provide some of the services we provide at present, being more efficient possibly, and maybe redeploy people. But it is a headache. It doesn't just happen automatically, and the transition period can be very painful.
Thank you for that answer. In a time of great division on both economic and cultural grounds, how do you believe that the study of economics itself can provide a format for common ground and well-reasoned debate?
Well, I am rather biased. I think economics teaches you a way to think. So you think if A, then B, possibly, but if something else comes and intervenes, then it could be C or D. We think a lot in terms of scenarios, of course, which helps hugely. And it's interesting when you look at the latest forecast or publications coming out of the Office for Budget Responsibility, which accompanies the budget. So it's there alongside what the Chancellor says. Each time he announces measures or big measures, they have stopped going for a single forecast and now look at scenarios. And I think what is really useful is to demonstrate what different scenarios might result in, so that policy can react in the right way. So that's one very, very positive way in which economists can contribute. Because obviously, if you do highlight the dangers and the risks, then perhaps policy can change, because we do know from history what works and doesn't work. So economics is very useful on that. And of course, views have changed. Looking back at what actually happened, quite a lot of ideologies have shifted as a result. And I think that's because people have looked at evidence a lot more. You haven't seen that all across. So if one were to even touch the Brexit debate, evidence was forgotten for a while, and we're now seeing some of the impacts of that. But evidence matters, and it's really what economists are very good at doing, is providing that evidence. It's also looking at what works and doesn't work, cost benefit, evaluating what has actually taken place, and looking at behavior and trying to analyze what it actually means, and therefore what can you expect if you do your A? Will B really happen, or is it going to be C or D or E or whatever, depending on what types of incentives individuals and businesses respond to. So it is absolutely important, particularly if you're working for government, for example, to look at value for money, to just assume you want a particular outcome, such as leveling up, without thinking what the consequences are. By leveling up, we mean making sure that all regions in the economy, or at least the disadvantaged ones, do better in the future. You've got to make sure that it doesn't happen at the expense of the better performing ones, because then you won't be able to redistribute everything for quite some time, and actually you may all end up poorer. And I worry a little bit that when ideology takes over, some of that evidence isn't used. And it's the job of the economists to be constantly reminding people of what the facts are telling you, even though sometimes calculating these facts and being absolutely certain that that's what they are can be quite difficult, but at least it is better than working without them.
Thank you. Now, finally, the purpose of GAEE UK is to inspire the next generation of economists. And as someone who has enjoyed a long and successful career as an economist, what advice would you give to those who are interested in the study of economics, and what are you currently working on that would help people reach this goal?
I think the point that I made earlier is still valid, that if you do economics, you think like an economist all your life. So you are there much more able to analyze what's happening and draw the right conclusions. So even if you don't work as an economist, but you work in any other capacity, I think having studied economics is, in my view, incredibly useful. You can also see now that economists are considerably more prominent in various roles. For example, the new head of the World Trade Organization, not only is she a lady, but she's also an economist, which is good news. You've seen also the new technocratic Prime Minister in Italy, the economist Mario Draghi, who was head of the European Central Bank. So there are quite a lot, actually, of role models you can see and realize that actually you can do an awful lot with economics. And I am writing a book alongside a few of my ex-colleagues from government and others called How to Be a Successful Economist. And that for me is really important. I was thinking originally to call it How to Be a Good Economist, but that for me is good enough in many ways. But it is important to encourage people to look at how you can indeed make a difference and influence what happens as an economist. It is really worth the effort of studying the subject and persevering with it.
Thank you, Vicky, for being so generous with your time today, and I am looking forward to hearing you speak in person again, hopefully in the not too distant future. The link to Vicky's recent book, Women versus Capitalism, is available in the description. And I know that our aspiring economists at GAEE UK will have found this interview to be inspirational. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you very much. Delighted to have been part of this.